Picture this: a small laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland. The year is 2019. A woman in her 50s wearing a white coat that bears the emblem of the World Health Organization stands before a room filled with the world's most distinguished scientists. Her hands shake slightly as she holds a small vial containing a clear liquid. This liquid, she announces, will change the course of human history. It will save millions of lives. It will end suffering that has plagued humanity for generations. The room erupts in applause, but the woman's eyes fill with tears. Not tears of joy, but tears of remembrance. She's thinking of a small mud hut in rural Bangladesh, where a little girl once studied by the flickering light of a single candle, dreaming of a world she was told she could never reach. That little girl was Dr. Rashida Rahman, and her story is one that will challenge everything you think you know about possibility, perseverance, and the power of an unbreakable human spirit. What would you do if the world told you you'd never make it? What would you do if your gender, your poverty, your very existence was seen as a limitation rather than a gift? Today I'm going to tell you about a woman who faced impossible odds, who was told that her dreams were too big, her ambitions too bold, and her gender too weak. Yet she rose from the rice fields of Bangladesh to the halls of international acclaim, discovering a cure that would touch every corner of our planet. This is more than just a success story. This is a testament to what happens when determination meets opportunity, when brilliance refuses to be dimmed by circumstance, and when one person's refusal to accept limitations becomes the world's greatest gift. Settle in, because the journey we're about to embark on will take you from the humblest of beginnings to heights most can only dream of. This is the story of how a farmer's daughter became the scientist who changed the world. The year was 1970, and in the small village of Kumargaon, nestled deep in the rural heartland of Bangladesh, the Rahman family welcomed their third daughter into the world. The midwife, an elderly woman whose weathered hands had delivered hundreds of babies in this village, shook her head with a mixture of pity and resignation. Another girl, she whispered to Rashida's mother, Fatima, who lay exhausted on a thin mattress in their one-room mud house. May Allah give you strength. In this village, like so many others across rural Bangladesh, the birth of a daughter was met with resigned acceptance rather than celebration. Girls were seen as temporary residents of their father's house, destined to be married off as soon as they came of age, requiring dowries that could bankrupt a family. Abdul Rahman, Rashida's father, was a rice farmer who owned less than 2 acres of land. His calloused hands told the story of decades spent bent over in flooded fields, planting and harvesting rice under the scorching sun, and during monsoon rains that could wash away a season's work in a single night. The family's mud house consisted of a single room with walls made from clay cow dung and straw topped with a corrugated tin roof that leaked during heavy rains and turned their home into an oven during the hot season. There was no electricity, no running water, and no furniture except for a few wooden stools and the thin mattresses they unrolled each night. The floor was packed earth, swept clean daily by Fatima, who rose before dawn to begin the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, and caring for her growing family. From her earliest memories, little Rashida was different. While her older sisters Nasreen and Sultana seemed content to help their mother with household chores and dreamed only of the day they would be married and have homes of their own, Rashida's eyes were always fixed on horizons beyond their small world. She would sit for hours watching the village teacher, Master Karim, as he walked past their house each morning, carrying his leather satchel filled with books and papers. The one-room school in their village only admitted boys, but Rashida would press her face against the gaps in their bamboo fence, straining to hear the lessons being taught inside. She memorized the sound of children reciting multiplication tables, the scratch of chalk on the blackboard, and the patient voice of Master Karim as he explained concepts that seemed as magical to her as fairy tales. When Rashida was 5 years old, she discovered that the village shop kept old newspapers to wrap purchases. She would volunteer to run errands, not for the few coins her parents would give her, but for the chance to study those newspapers before they were used as wrapping. She couldn't read yet, but she was fascinated by the black marks on white paper that somehow contained meaning. She would trace the letters with her finger, memorizing their shapes, sensing that they held keys to worlds she couldn't yet imagine. The shopkeeper, An old man named Hassan noticed her fascination and began saving discarded books and papers for her. "This little one has fire in her eyes," he would tell the other villagers, though most would shake their heads and mutter about the foolishness of encouraging such impossible dreams in a girl. Rashida's parents, while loving, could not understand their daughter's strange obsession with books and learning. Abdul would watch her tracing letters in the dirt with a stick and shake his head. "She should be learning to cook and clean," he would tell Fatima. "What good will letters do her when she's married and raising children?" Fatima, who had never learned to read herself, found herself torn between her natural desire to encourage her daughter's curiosity and the practical knowledge that education was not a path available to girls in their world. She had married Abdul when she was 14, never having spent a single day in school, and had assumed that her daughters would follow the same path. The family's poverty was a constant presence in their lives, as real and persistent as the mud that clung to their bare feet during the rainy season. Meals were simple affairs: rice with a small portion of lentils or vegetables, occasionally supplemented with a piece of fish when Abdul had a good day at the market. There were times during the lean season, between harvests, when even rice was scarce, and the family would survive on thin gruel made from rice husks and whatever edible plants Fatima could gather from the countryside. Rashida would lie awake at night, her stomach gnawing with hunger, but her mind filled with dreams of the books she had seen, the letters she had memorized, and the vast world that existed beyond their village boundaries. Despite the hardships, there was love in the Rahman household. Abdul would tell stories in the evenings, tales passed down from his grandfather about brave heroes in distant lands. Fatima would sing traditional lullabies as she braided her daughter's hair, but underlying all of this warmth was the constant awareness that life offered limited paths for girls like Rashida. By the time she was 7 years old, her parents had already begun discussing her eventual marriage, setting aside small amounts of money whenever possible to begin accumulating the dowry that would be required to find her a husband. In their minds, they were being responsible parents, preparing for their daughter's future in the only way they knew how. Everything changed for Rashida on a sweltering afternoon in July 1978, just after her 8th birthday. She was helping her mother tend to their small vegetable garden behind their house when she heard an unfamiliar sound: the puttering engine of a motorcycle making its way down the dusty village path. Motorcycles were rare in Kumargaon, usually belonging only to the wealthiest merchants or government officials, so the entire neighborhood gathered to see who this visitor might be. The motorcycle stopped in front of their house, and its rider removed her helmet to reveal a young woman with kind eyes and a determined expression. She wore a simple salwar kameez, but it was clean and well-fitted, and she carried herself with a confidence that immediately commanded respect. The woman introduced herself as Shahida Begum, a nurse and health worker employed by a new government initiative to bring basic medical care and education to rural villages. She had been assigned to Kumargaon and the surrounding area, and she was conducting a survey to understand the health and educational needs of local families. As she spoke with Abdul and Fatima, answering their questions about her work and her training, Rashida found herself mesmerized. Here was a woman not much older than her sister Nasreen, who traveled alone, worked in a professional capacity, and spoke with the authority of someone who had received an education. It was the first time Rashida had encountered a woman who lived outside the traditional roles she had always assumed were the only possibilities for her gender. Shahida noticed Rashida's intense attention and began directing some of her questions toward the young girl. "Do you go to school?" she asked gently. When Rashida shook her head, Shahida continued, "Can you read?" Again a shake of the head, but this time accompanied by such longing in the child's eyes that Shahida felt her heart stir. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small children's book with colorful pictures and simple words. "Would you like to learn?" she asked, and Rashida's vigorous nod was so enthusiastic that even her parents couldn't help but smile. Over the following months, Shahida became a regular visitor to the Rahman household. Her official duties brought her to the village weekly, but she made it a point to spend extra time with Rashida, teaching her the basics of reading and writing. They would sit under the large banyan tree at the edge of the village, using a piece of slate and chalk that Shahida had brought from the district town. Rashida proved to be an extraordinarily quick learner. absorbing not just the mechanics of reading but developing a deep love for the stories and information that books contained. Shahida brought her simple science books written for children, and Rashida's eyes would widen with wonder as she learned about the human body, about plants and animals, and about the vast universe beyond their small village. The other villagers watched this unusual tutoring arrangement with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Some of the older women would shake their heads and mutter about the impropriety of filling a young girl's head with ideas above her station. What good will reading do when she's married and has children to feed? They would ask each other. But Rashida's parents, initially skeptical, began to see changes in their daughter that gave them pause. She became more articulate, more confident, and seemed to approach even her household chores with a systematic intelligence that impressed them. When Shahida suggested that Rashida had the potential to attend school, Abdul and Fatima found themselves considering possibilities they had never imagined. The obstacle, however, was significant. The village school only accepted boys, and the nearest school that admitted girls was in the district town, 15 miles away by bus. The cost of transportation, school fees, books, and uniforms was far beyond what the Rahman family could afford on their meager farming income. Moreover, the cultural barriers were immense. No girl from Kumargaon had ever attended school beyond the village level, and the idea of sending an unmarried daughter away from home each day was almost unthinkable to most families. Abdul and Fatima spent many nights discussing the situation in hushed tones, weighing their daughter's obvious intelligence and desire against the practical and social obstacles that stood in her way. Shahida, however, was not easily deterred. She had grown up in a middle-class family in Dhaka and had seen firsthand how education could transform not just an individual, but entire families and communities. She began researching scholarship programs and support systems that might make Rashida's education possible. She contacted her former professors at the nursing college, reached out to women's organizations, and even wrote letters to government officials responsible for rural development. Her persistence and advocacy for this one bright child from a remote village exemplified the kind of dedication that could change lives. The breakthrough came in the form of a new government program designed to increase female literacy in rural areas. The program provided scholarships to promising girls from farming families, covering not just school fees, but also transportation costs and basic supplies. The selection process was rigorous, requiring written examinations and interviews, but Shahida was confident that Rashida could meet the challenges. She spent weeks preparing the 8-year-old girl for the examination, reviewing everything from basic mathematics to reading comprehension, and perhaps most importantly, helping her develop the confidence to believe that she belonged in that testing room alongside dozens of other candidates. The day of the examination was both terrifying and thrilling for Rashida. It was her first time leaving her village, her first ride on a public bus, and her first glimpse of the district town with its concrete buildings, busy markets, and crowds of people. Shahida accompanied her, holding her hand and offering quiet encouragement as they walked into the examination center. Rashida looked around at the other candidates, most of them older, many of them better dressed, all of them seeming more confident than she felt. And for a moment her resolve wavered. But then she remembered all the nights she had spent studying by candlelight, all the hours Shahida had spent teaching her, and all the dreams that had sustained her through the hardships of her daily life. She picked up her pencil and began to write, pouring 8 years of accumulated hunger for knowledge onto the examination papers. 3 weeks after the examination, Shahida arrived at the Rahman house with news that would change everything. Rashida had not only passed the scholarship examination, she had scored in the top 5% of all applicants across the entire district. The scholarship would cover her enrollment at Rashidpur Girls' High School, along with transportation, books, and even a small monthly stipend for incidental expenses. Abdul and Fatima listened to this news with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Their daughter, the little girl who had learned to read under a banyan tree, would now be attending the same school as daughters of merchants and government officials. The night before Rashida's first day of school, Fatima stayed up late sewing her daughter's new school uniform by hand, using fabric that Shahida had helped them purchase from the market. The uniform was simple, a white cotton shirt and navy blue skirt, but to Rashida, it represented entry into a world she had only imagined. She tried it on repeatedly that evening, standing before the small mirror that was their family's only luxury, trying to see herself as a student rather than a farmer's daughter. Abdul, who had initially been skeptical about the entire enterprise, found himself choking with emotion as he watched his daughter prepare for this momentous step into her future. The daily routine that began the next morning would continue for the next 4 years. Rashida would wake before dawn, help her mother with breakfast and morning chores, then walk the 2 miles to the bus stop where she would catch the overcrowded public bus to town. The journey took nearly an hour each way, winding through rice paddies and small villages, and Rashida used every minute of it to study or to observe the changing landscape outside her window. She carried her books in a cloth bag that Fatima had sewn, along with a simple lunch of rice and vegetables wrapped in a banana leaf. She was usually the youngest passenger on the bus, certainly the most simply dressed, and often the target of curious stares from other travelers who wondered what a village girl was doing with school books. Her first day at Rashidpur Girls' High School was overwhelming in ways she could never have anticipated. The school building was larger than any structure she had ever seen, with multiple floors, dozens of classrooms, and hundreds of students. The other girls seemed to belong to a different world entirely. They carried expensive book bags, wore watches and jewelry, and spoke in accents that marked them as daughters of educated families. During the lunch break, while her classmates shared elaborate meals from tiffin carriers, Rashida quietly ate her simple rice and vegetables, acutely aware of the gulf between her circumstances and theirs. The academic work itself, however, was where Rashida truly shone. Years of self-directed learning and Shahida's careful tutoring had given her not just knowledge, but an approach to learning that her teachers immediately recognized as exceptional. She absorbed information like a sponge, asked thoughtful questions, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of complex concepts that impressed even the most experienced educators. Her mathematics teacher, Mrs. Khatun, noticed that Rashida could solve problems using methods she had apparently developed on her own, often arriving at correct answers through unconventional but elegant reasoning. Her science teacher, Dr. Hossein, was amazed by her curiosity about the natural world and her ability to make connections between different areas of study. But social integration proved more challenging than academic success. The cultural and economic gaps between Rashida and her classmates were vast and sometimes painfully obvious. She couldn't afford to participate in many school activities, didn't have the leisure time for casual socializing after classes, and often felt like an outsider looking in on the easy camaraderie that existed among girls who had grown up in similar circumstances. Some of her classmates were kind and welcoming, but others seemed to view her as a curiosity, the village girl who had somehow found her way into their world. There were whispered comments about her simple clothes, her rural accent, and her obvious poverty that cut deeper than any academic challenge. The pressure extended beyond the social dynamics at school. Each evening, when Rashida returned to the village after her long day of classes and commuting, she was expected to resume her responsibilities as the daughter of a farming family. She helped with cooking, cleaning, and caring for her younger brother who had been born 2 years earlier. During planting and harvest seasons, she worked in the rice fields alongside her parents, her hands soon bearing the same calluses that marked her as a farmer's child. The other village girls, who had never left Kumargaon, found it increasingly difficult to relate to her experiences, and she often felt caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither. Despite these challenges, Rashida's academic performance continued to excel. By the end of her first year, she ranked second in her class of 45 students. Her teachers began to discuss her potential for higher education, mentioning the possibility of university study, an idea so far beyond her family's experience that it seemed almost fantastical. When Mrs. Khatun suggested that Rashida had the intellectual capacity to become a doctor, engineer, or scientist, Fatima listened with the same wonder she might reserve for fairy tales. These were careers that existed in books and newspapers, not possibilities for girls from families like theirs. The financial strain of supporting Rashida's education, even with the scholarship, was significant for the Rahman family. Although the major expenses were covered, there were countless small costs that accumulated: additional notebooks, pencils, exam fees, and occasional group projects that required materials or supplies. More significantly, Rashida's time in school meant that she was less available to help with household and farming duties, placing additional burden on her mother and sisters. There were times when Abdul wondered if they were making the right choice, especially when neighbors would comment about the impracticality of educating a daughter who would eventually marry and leave their family anyway. The turning point in community perception came during Rashida's second year, when a serious illness struck the village. Several children developed symptoms of what the local traditional healer couldn't identify or treat effectively. Shahida was away on assignment in another district, and the nearest qualified medical facility was hours away by bus. Rashida, drawing on the biology and health education she had been receiving at school, recognized the symptoms as potentially indicating typhoid fever, and convinced her parents to organize transportation for the affected families to seek proper medical treatment. Her intervention likely saved several lives and demonstrated to the village that her education had practical value that extended beyond personal advancement. This incident marked a subtle but important shift in how the community viewed Rashida's educational journey. Rather than seeing her studies as an expensive indulgence or a rejection of traditional values, villagers began to understand that her knowledge could benefit everyone. Parents started asking her to help their children with basic mathematics or reading. The village council sought her advice when official letters arrived from government offices. She became a bridge between the traditional knowledge of her community and the modern world that existed beyond their boundaries, proving that education didn't mean abandoning one's roots, but rather expanding one's ability to serve others. As Rashida progressed through her high school years, her teachers increasingly recognized her exceptional potential. Dr. Hossein, her science teacher, began providing her with additional resources and challenges, lending her advanced textbooks and encouraging her to participate in regional science competitions. Mrs. Khatun arranged for her to receive extra tutoring in mathematics from a retired professor who lived in town. These educators saw in Rashida not just a bright student, but someone who might have the potential to make significant contributions to society if given the right opportunities and support. As Rashida entered her final year of high school, the question of her future became impossible to ignore. Her academic performance had been consistently outstanding. She now ranked first in her class and had won several district-level competitions in mathematics and science. Her teachers were unanimous in their belief that she should pursue higher education, but the obstacles ahead seemed almost insurmountable. The nearest university was in Dhaka, hundreds of miles away, and would require not just academic preparation but financial resources far beyond what her family possessed. Moreover, the cultural barriers to sending an unmarried daughter to live independently in a large city were enormous, challenging not just economic constraints, but fundamental beliefs about appropriate behavior for young women. The first major confrontation came from within her own extended family. Abdul's older brother, who had always been critical of Rashida's education, became increasingly vocal in his opposition as university became a possibility. During a family gathering, he cornered Abdul with arguments that reflected the prevailing attitudes of their community. "You've already spent too much money on this foolishness," he declared. "Rashida is 18 years old now. It's time for her to be married and start her real life as a wife and mother. All this book learning is just making her proud and unmarriageable. What family will want a daughter-in-law who thinks she's too good for traditional women's work?" His words carried weight because they reflected genuine concerns that many families in their situation would share. The pressure intensified when several families in the village approached Abdul with marriage proposals for Rashida. These weren't casual inquiries but serious offers from respectable families who had observed her character and intelligence and believed she would make a good wife for their sons. The proposed matches were actually quite favorable by village standards. The suitors were educated young men with steady jobs as teachers or clerks, offering dowry requirements that were reasonable and promising comfortable lives for their future wives. Abdul found himself torn between pride in his daughter's accomplishments and the practical knowledge that these opportunities might not be available indefinitely. Rashida listened to these discussions with growing anxiety and determination. She had worked too hard and come too far to abandon her dreams now, but she also understood the validity of her family's concerns. They had sacrificed for her education, and she couldn't dismiss their worries about her future security and happiness. One evening, as the family discussed a particularly attractive marriage proposal, she asked for permission to speak. With a maturity that surprised even her parents, she presented a carefully thought-out argument for why continuing her education would ultimately benefit not just herself, but her entire family. She spoke about the careers that would be available to her with a university degree, the financial security that would come from professional employment, and her commitment to supporting her parents in their old age. Her presentation was eloquent and logical, but it also revealed how much she had changed from the village girl who had first boarded the bus to town 4 years earlier. Rashida's confidence, her vocabulary, and her way of analyzing problems marked her as someone who had been transformed by education. Some family members found this transformation inspiring, but others found it threatening. Her uncle shook his head and muttered about daughters who had become too proud to respect their elders' wisdom. Even Abdul, who loved his daughter deeply, felt a growing uncertainty about whether they had perhaps allowed her ambitions to grow beyond what was healthy or realistic. The academic challenges of preparing for university entrance examinations were immense. The competition for admission to Dhaka University, the country's most prestigious institution, was fierce, with thousands of applicants competing for a limited number of spots. The examination covered subjects at a depth and sophistication far beyond what was typically taught at rural high schools. Rashida found herself studying materials that challenged not just her knowledge, but her very understanding of what academic work could entail. She borrowed advanced textbooks from her teachers, traveled to town on weekends to access the public library, and spent countless hours working through practice problems that often left her feeling inadequate and overwhelmed. The financial reality of university attendance became increasingly stark as application deadlines approached. Even if she were accepted and received some form of scholarship assistance, the costs of living in Dhaka would be enormous. Room and board, transportation, books, and countless incidental expenses would require resources that her family simply didn't possess. Abdul began exploring options for borrowing money, potentially mortgaging their small plot of farmland. But the risks were terrifying. If Rashida's education didn't lead to employment sufficient to repay these debts, the family could lose everything they had worked generations to build. Dr. Hossein and Mrs. Khatun, recognizing the obstacles their star student faced, began advocating on her behalf within their professional networks. They contacted former colleagues who had moved to universities, reached out to women's organizations that supported female education, and researched every available scholarship and grant program. Their efforts revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of the support systems available to students like Rashida. While there were programs designed to help promising students from rural backgrounds, the competition was intense, and the application processes were complex and demanding. The emotional toll of this uncertain period was significant for the entire Rahman family. Rashida found herself suffering from stress-related headaches and sleepless nights, constantly worrying about whether she was making the right choices for herself and her family. Fatima watched her daughter's struggles with maternal anguish, wanting to support her dreams while also fearing the consequences of failure. Abdul wrestled with doubts about whether he had been irresponsible in allowing his daughter's ambitions to develop to this point, knowing that disappointment would be crushing for everyone involved. The social pressure within the village intensified as word spread about Rashida's university aspirations. Some neighbors expressed admiration for her achievements, but others were openly critical of what they saw as unrealistic dreaming that would ultimately lead to disappointment and financial ruin for her family. The village imam delivered a sermon that, while not mentioning Rashida by name, clearly criticized families who allowed their daughters to develop ambitions that exceeded traditional roles. Allah has given each of us our proper place in society, he declared. When we reach beyond what is intended for us, we risk not just our own souls but the stability of our entire community. These criticisms were particularly painful because they came from people who had known Rashida since childhood and had watched her grow up. The shopkeeper who had first encouraged her love of books now shook his head and suggested that perhaps she had been given too much encouragement. Former teachers at the village school commented that while education was good for girls, university was probably excessive and might make her unmarriageable. Even some of her female relatives who had initially been proud of her accomplishments began expressing doubts about the wisdom of pursuing goals that seemed so far removed from the realities of women's lives in their community. The most painful opposition came from an unexpected source. Her older sister Nasreen, who had married 2 years earlier and now had a baby daughter. During a visit home, Nasreen confronted Rashida with accusations that cut to the heart of their changing relationship. "You think you're better than us now," she said with tears in her eyes. "You've forgotten where you come from, forgotten that family should come first. While you're dreaming about becoming some big city doctor or scientist, I'm here helping Mama and taking care of my responsibilities. But you're too proud now to do the work that women in our family have always done." Her words reflected not just personal hurt, but a genuine fear that education was pulling Rashida away from the values and relationships that had always defined their family. As the university application deadline approached, Rashida faced a moment of crisis that would determine the trajectory of her entire life. The examination was scheduled for early spring, and she would need to travel to Dhaka, her first time in the capital city, to take the tests that would determine her future. The journey itself would require money they could barely afford, and success would commit her family to financial obligations that could potentially bankrupt them. Failure, on the other hand, would mean the end of dreams that had sustained her through years of hardship and study. The night before she was scheduled to leave for Dhaka, Abdul sat with his daughter under the same banyan tree where Shahida had first taught her to read almost 10 years earlier. The conversation they had that evening would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. Abdul spoke about his own dreams as a young man, ambitions he had abandoned in favor of practical necessities, and his complex feelings about watching his daughter reach for goals he had never imagined possible. Rashida spoke about her love for her family, her commitment to never abandoning her roots, and her belief that success would allow her to help not just herself but everyone who had supported her journey. The journey to Dhaka was Rashida's first real encounter with the world beyond her district, and it proved to be as overwhelming as any examination she would face. The capital city assaulted her senses with its crowds, traffic, noise, and sheer scale of human activity. Buildings stretched toward the sky in ways she had never imagined. Streets teemed with cars, buses, and rickshaws in organized chaos, and the air itself seemed thick with ambition and possibility. She clutched her small bag containing her examination materials, travel documents, and enough money for 3 days of the most basic accommodations, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the magnitude of the world that had suddenly opened before her. The guest house where she stayed was unlike anything in her experience. A narrow, multi-story building wedged between similar structures, with shared bathrooms and rooms barely large enough for a single bed. Her roommate for the 2-day examination period was another girl from a rural background, Salma, who came from a fishing village in the coastal region. Despite their different origins, they found immediate common ground in their shared nervousness, their simple backgrounds, and their determination to succeed against overwhelming odds. They spent the evening before the examination quizzing each other, sharing their meager meal of rice and vegetables, and offering mutual encouragement that helped calm their fears. The examination venue was Dhaka University itself, and walking onto that campus for the first time was like entering a different universe. The buildings were grand and imposing, with architectural details that spoke of learning, tradition, and intellectual achievement. Students moved across the grounds with confident strides, carrying books and engaged in animated discussions about subjects that sounded sophisticated and worldly. Rashida felt acutely conscious of her simple clothes, her rural accent, and her obvious unfamiliarity with university customs and expectations. But she also felt a deep sense of belonging, as if all her years of study and dreams had been preparing her for exactly this moment. The written examination was grueling, lasting 8 hours over 2 days and covering mathematics, sciences, English, and Bengali literature at levels that pushed her to the absolute limits of her preparation. Some questions seemed designed to test not just knowledge but the kind of analytical thinking that could only be developed through years of advanced study. Rashida drew on every resource she had accumulated: her teacher's lessons, her independent reading, her natural problem-solving abilities, and the resilience that had carried her through years of adversity. When she encountered questions that seemed beyond her preparation, she forced herself to remain calm and approach them systematically, often finding solutions through creative reasoning rather than memorized formulas. The oral examination portion was even more intimidating. She faced a panel of 3 professors, distinguished academics whose achievements and reputations preceded them into the examination room. They questioned her not just about her academic knowledge but about her motivations, her plans for the future, and her understanding of the responsibilities that would come with a university education. One professor, Dr. Mahmoud, seemed particularly skeptical about her rural background and asked pointed questions about whether she truly understood the demands of university study and the competitive nature of academic life in the capital city. "Young lady," Dr. Mahmoud said, his tone carrying a mixture of challenge and genuine curiosity, "you come from a very different world than the one you're hoping to enter. University life requires not just intelligence but cultural adaptability, financial resources, and social skills that may be quite different from what you've experienced. Are you prepared for the possibility that you might find the adjustment overwhelming? Have you considered that returning to your village and accepting a more traditional path might ultimately be more fulfilling and realistic?" Rashida's response to this question would later be remembered by all 3 professors as one of the most compelling they had ever heard in an admissions interview. She spoke about her journey from illiteracy to academic achievement, acknowledging the challenges she would face while demonstrating a mature understanding of both her strengths and limitations. She talked about her commitment to using education not as an escape from her origins, but as a tool for serving others who came from similar circumstances. Most importantly, she articulated a vision of how higher education could bridge the gap between traditional knowledge and modern capabilities, allowing her to contribute to both her local community and the broader world. "I understand that I will face difficulties that other students may not experience," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But I also bring perspectives and motivations that might be valuable in ways that are not immediately obvious. I've learned that education is not about abandoning where you come from. It's about expanding your ability to contribute to the world around you. If I succeed here, I won't just be helping myself. I'll be proving that talent and determination can exist anywhere, and perhaps making it easier for other students from backgrounds like mine to follow similar paths." The professors exchanged glances, and Dr. Mahmoud nodded slowly. The formal examination was over, but he had one final question. "If you were accepted to the university," he asked, "what field of study would you pursue and why?" Rashida's answer came without hesitation. "Medicine, with a focus on public health and infectious diseases. I want to work on health problems that affect rural communities like the one I come from. Problems that often go unrecognized because the people who suffer from them don't have voices in the places where medical priorities are determined." The wait for examination results was agonizing. Rashida returned to her village and resumed her daily routine, but everything felt suspended and uncertain. She helped with the rice harvest, taught basic literacy to neighborhood children, and tried to maintain normalcy while internally counting down the days until results would be announced. Her parents watched her carefully, noting her attempts to appear calm while recognizing the anxiety that consumed her. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath, aware that the outcome would affect not just Rashida, but everyone who had supported her unconventional journey. 3 months after the examination, a letter arrived at the local post office addressed to Miss Rashida Rahman. The postmaster, who had known her since childhood, walked personally to the Rahman house to deliver it, understanding the significance of this moment for the entire community. The family gathered in their small room as Rashida opened the envelope with trembling hands. The letter was brief and formal, but its message would change everything. She had been accepted to the medical program at Dhaka University, with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition and a modest living allowance. The celebration that erupted in the village that evening was unprecedented. Neighbors who had been skeptical about Rashida's ambitions now claimed to have always believed in her potential. Children gathered around to hear the letter read aloud multiple times. The imam, who had previously questioned the wisdom of excessive education for girls, offered prayers of gratitude and acknowledged that perhaps Allah had special plans for this young woman. Shahida, who had traveled from her current assignment to be present for this moment, wept openly as she embraced the girl she had first taught to read under the banyan tree years earlier. But even in the midst of celebration, the practical challenges loomed large. The partial scholarship would cover basic expenses, but Rashida would still need additional support for books, supplies, and the countless incidental costs of university life. Moreover, she would be entering a world where her rural background, her accent, and her obvious poverty would mark her as different from most of her peers. The path ahead was clear, but it would require every ounce of determination and resilience she had developed over the past decade. Rashida's arrival at Dhaka University in the fall of 1988 marked the beginning of the most challenging period of her life. The campus that had seemed impressive during her examination now became her daily environment, but familiarity bred not contempt, but rather a deeper appreciation of how much she had to learn beyond academic subjects. The other first-year medical students came predominantly from urban, educated families. They spoke English with fluency that came from years of private tutoring, wore clothes that marked them as members of the emerging middle class, and navigated university social dynamics with an ease that seemed almost genetic. Her first roommate in the women's hostel was Shirin, the daughter of a prominent Dhaka physician who had attended the same university 20 years earlier. Shirin was intelligent, kind-hearted, and well-meaning, but the casual assumptions she made about normal life revealed the vast gulf between their backgrounds. She owned more books than Rashida had ever seen in one place, received weekly care packages from home containing foods that were luxuries beyond Rashida's imagination, and spoke casually about family trips to London and Bangkok that sounded like fairy tales. When Shirin learned that Rashida had never used a computer, never eaten in a restaurant, and had never spoken to a foreigner, she was genuinely amazed rather than judgmental, but her amazement only highlighted how much Rashida had to learn about the world she was entering. The academic work itself was more demanding than anything Rashida had previously encountered, but it was the kind of challenge she had always relished. Medical school required not just memorization, but a complex form of analytical thinking that integrated chemistry, biology, physics, and human psychology into a coherent understanding of health and disease. She threw herself into her studies with an intensity that impressed her professors and sometimes concerned her classmates. While other students balanced their academic work with social activities, part-time jobs, and family obligations, Rashida had only one focus: mastering the material that would eventually allow her to heal others. Her financial constraints forced her to be creative in ways that often surprised her peers. She couldn't afford to buy new textbooks, so she developed a system of borrowing, copying essential chapters by hand, and trading access to her meticulous notes for temporary use of expensive reference materials. She worked part-time in the university library, shelving books and maintaining catalog systems in exchange for a small salary and unlimited access to medical journals and research publications. Her tiny room in the hostel became a study sanctuary where she would often work until dawn, fueled by simple meals she prepared on a small electric kettle, and the determination that had carried her from the rice fields of Kumargaon to the medical laboratories of Dhaka University. The social isolation was more difficult to manage than the academic pressures. Most of her classmates had grown up together in Dhaka's interconnected social circles, attending the same schools, sharing common cultural references, and maintaining friendships that stretched back to childhood. Rashida's attempts to join study groups or social activities were met with politeness but rarely with genuine inclusion. Her rural accent marked her as different. Her obvious poverty made her uncomfortable in expensive restaurants or social venues, and her intense focus on academics sometimes made her seem aloof when she was actually just uncertain about social expectations. The breakthrough in her social adjustment came during her second year, when she was paired with a classmate named Karim for a particularly challenging anatomy project. Karim came from a middle-class family in Chittagong and had initially been skeptical about working with the village girl, who seemed so serious and unfamiliar with city ways. However, as they spent long hours in the laboratory together, dissecting cadavers and studying human physiology, he began to recognize the depth of her knowledge and the originality of her thinking. Rashida's questions weren't just about memorizing facts. She wanted to understand underlying principles, to explore connections between different body systems, and to consider how medical knowledge could be applied to solve real-world health problems. "You think about medicine differently than the rest of us," Karim told her one evening as they worked late in the laboratory. Most of us are trying to learn enough to pass examinations and become doctors, but you're trying to understand how medicine can change people's lives. His observation was accurate. Rashida's motivation for studying medicine wasn't primarily about personal advancement or financial security. It was about addressing the health problems she had observed in her home village and countless similar communities across rural Bangladesh. This deeper sense of purpose began to set her apart in ways that her professors noticed and admired. When asked to write case studies, she would often choose scenarios that reflected the realities of patients who lacked access to sophisticated medical facilities or expensive treatments. When participating in class discussions about treatment options, she would raise questions about cost, availability, and cultural factors that more privileged students rarely considered. Her perspective brought a practical dimension to academic discussions that enriched the learning experience for everyone. Dr. Sarah Ahmed, who taught infectious diseases, became the first professor to recognize not just Rashida's academic abilities, but her potential for making significant contributions to medical research and practice. Dr. Ahmed had herself grown up in modest circumstances and had observed how students from rural backgrounds often brought unique insights to medical problems that their urban peers might overlook. She began inviting Rashida to participate in research projects related to tropical diseases and public health challenges that disproportionately affected rural populations. Working with Dr. Ahmed opened Rashida's eyes to the world of medical research and the possibility that she might contribute not just as a practicing physician, but as a scientist who could develop new approaches to health problems. She learned about research methodologies, statistical analysis, and the complex process of testing and validating new medical treatments. Most importantly, she began to understand how medical research could be directed toward problems that affected the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations, problems that were often ignored by researchers who focused on diseases that primarily affected wealthy patients in developed countries. The financial pressures of university life remained constant and sometimes overwhelming. Rashida's scholarship covered basic tuition and a minimal living allowance, but medical school required numerous additional expenses: laboratory fees, specialized equipment, clinical rotations that required transportation across the city, and countless small costs that added up to significant amounts. She took on additional part-time work tutoring younger students, but this meant less time for her own studies and research. There were months when she survived on rice and lentils for days at a time, and occasions when she had to choose between buying required textbooks and paying for transportation to clinical placements. The most difficult period came during her third year, when her father suffered a serious injury during harvest season and was unable to work for several months. The family's already precarious financial situation became desperate, and Rashida received urgent letters from home describing their need for money to pay for Abdul's medical treatment and to hire laborers to complete the rice harvest. She found herself torn between her responsibilities to her family and her commitment to completing her education. The thought of withdrawing from medical school to return home and help support her family was agonizing, but it seemed like the only responsible choice. It was Dr. Ahmed who provided the solution that allowed Rashida to continue her studies while also helping her family. The professor had been awarded a research grant to study cholera prevention in rural communities, and she offered Rashida a position as a research assistant that would provide additional income and valuable experience while allowing her to conduct some of her fieldwork in her home district. This arrangement not only solved Rashida's immediate financial crisis but also provided her with opportunities to apply her growing medical knowledge to the health problems she had observed in her own community. The research project took her back to Kumargaon and surrounding villages during university breaks, but now she returned not as the girl who had left to pursue impossible dreams, but as a medical student conducting scientific research. Villagers who had once questioned the value of her education now lined up to participate in health surveys and prevention programs. Children who had never seen a doctor trusted her to examine them and provide basic medical advice. Her work became a bridge between the sophisticated medical knowledge she was acquiring at university and the practical health needs of rural communities that often had little access to professional health care. As she progressed through her clinical rotations during her 4th and 5th years, Rashida's unique background and perspective increasingly set her apart from her peers. While other students focused on prestigious specialties like surgery or cardiology, she found herself drawn to infectious diseases, public health, and tropical medicine, areas that directly addressed the health problems she had witnessed throughout her childhood. Her clinical supervisors noted her exceptional ability to communicate with patients from diverse backgrounds, her thorough understanding of how poverty and social conditions affected health outcomes, and her creative approaches to treatment plans that considered patients' economic limitations and cultural beliefs. The most transformative experience of her medical school years came during a clinical rotation in a rural hospital located in a district similar to her home region. The hospital was understaffed, under-equipped, and overwhelmed by the health needs of a population that had little access to preventive care or early treatment for serious conditions. Rashida worked 18-hour days, treating patients with advanced tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, and countless other conditions that were rarely seen in Dhaka's modern hospitals. She slept on a cot in the hospital staff room, ate simple meals prepared by local villagers, and found herself using not just her medical training, but also her deep understanding of rural life to connect with patients who might have been intimidated by a more conventional physician. It was during this rotation that Rashida first encountered the disease that would eventually define her career and her contribution to global health. A family arrived at the hospital carrying a young child who exhibited symptoms that didn't fit any standard diagnostic category. The child had a fever, severe fatigue, and distinctive skin lesions that appeared to be spreading rapidly. The senior physician on duty was baffled, but Rashida remembered reading about similar cases in an obscure medical journal article about emerging infectious diseases in tropical regions. Her suggested diagnosis proved correct, and her quick identification of the condition allowed for appropriate treatment that likely saved the child's life. That evening, as she wrote her rotation report, Rashida found herself wondering how many similar cases went undiagnosed in rural areas where physicians lacked access to specialized training or current medical literature. She began to envision research that could improve diagnostic capabilities in resource-limited settings, and treatment protocols that could be implemented by healthcare workers with basic training rather than requiring specialists with advanced degrees. These ideas would eventually evolve into the research program that would make her famous, but at the time, they were simply the natural result of a brilliant mind grappling with the practical challenges of providing healthcare to underserved populations. Graduation from medical school in 1993 marked not an ending but a transformation in Rashida's journey. She had completed her degree with the highest honors in her class, earning recognition not just for her academic excellence, but for her innovative approach to clinical problem-solving and her commitment to addressing healthcare challenges in rural communities. Dr. Ahmed had spent months advocating for Rashida to receive a prestigious fellowship that would allow her to pursue graduate research in infectious diseases, arguing that her unique combination of medical knowledge, research ability, and deep understanding of rural health challenges made her an ideal candidate for advanced study. The fellowship took her to the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research in Dhaka, an institution renowned for its groundbreaking work on cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases that disproportionately affected developing countries. For the first time in her life, Rashida found herself in an environment where her rural background and focus on diseases affecting the poor were not just accepted, but were considered valuable assets. The center's research mission aligned perfectly with her own goals, and she threw herself into her work with an enthusiasm that impressed even researchers who had devoted decades to similar studies. Her mentor, Dr. Michael Richardson, was a British infectious disease specialist who had spent most of his career working in tropical regions around the world. Dr. Richardson had initially been skeptical about taking on a student from rural Bangladesh, worried that her limited exposure to international research standards might require more supervision than he could provide. However, within weeks of beginning her fellowship, he realized that Rashida brought not just intelligence and dedication, but also insights that could only come from lived experience with the conditions they were studying. Her questions challenged assumptions that international researchers often made about how diseases spread and how interventions might be implemented in real-world settings. Rashida's first research project focused on developing improved diagnostic methods for typhoid fever, in settings where sophisticated laboratory equipment was not available. Traditional diagnostic approaches required expensive equipment and highly trained technicians, making them impractical for rural hospitals and clinics. Working with a team of biochemists and engineers, she helped develop a simple, inexpensive test that could provide accurate results within hours rather than days, using materials that could be easily transported and stored even in hot, humid climates without refrigeration. The breakthrough came during the second year of her fellowship, when she was analyzing blood samples from patients who had been diagnosed with typhoid but were not responding to standard treatments. Using techniques she had learned for identifying bacterial genetic markers, she discovered that several samples contained a previously unknown strain of the typhoid bacterium that had developed resistance to multiple antibiotics. More importantly, this resistant strain appeared to be spreading rapidly through rural communities where antibiotic use was often inappropriate due to limited medical supervision and counterfeit medications. This discovery had immediate practical implications for public health policy, but it also opened research questions that would occupy Rashida for the next several years. She began investigating how antibiotic-resistant bacteria spread in rural communities, what factors contributed to the development of resistance, and how treatment protocols could be modified to address this emerging threat. Her work required her to travel extensively throughout Bangladesh and neighboring countries, collecting samples, interviewing patients, and working with local healthcare providers to understand how medical practices in rural areas might be inadvertently contributing to the problem. The international recognition began gradually but built momentum as her research findings were published in prestigious medical journals. Her papers consistently demonstrated not just scientific rigor but also practical relevance to real-world health problems. Unlike many researchers who focused on narrowly defined questions of primarily academic interest, Rashida's work always maintained clear connections to improving health outcomes for the population she studied. Conferences and symposiums began inviting her to present her findings, and she found herself traveling to countries she had never imagined visiting, sharing her research with audiences that included some of the world's most distinguished medical scientists. The most significant breakthrough in her research career came during her fourth year at the research center, when she was investigating an outbreak of severe diarrheal illness in a remote region near the Myanmar border. The symptoms were similar to cholera, but laboratory tests consistently came back negative for the cholera bacterium. Working with local health authorities and international disease surveillance networks, Rashida eventually identified a previously unknown pathogen that was causing symptoms nearly identical to cholera, but was resistant to standard cholera treatments. The discovery of this new pathogen, which was eventually named Vibrio Rashida in her honor, represented a major contribution to understanding of infectious diseases in tropical regions. But more importantly for global health, Rashida's research team was able to develop both diagnostic tests and treatment protocols for the new disease, preventing what could have become a major epidemic. The World Health Organization took notice, and Rashida found herself being consulted on disease outbreak investigations around the world. It was during this period that Rashida met Dr. James Chen, a Chinese-American epidemiologist working for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Dr. Chen had been sent to Bangladesh to investigate the Vibrio Rashidae outbreak and to evaluate whether it posed a threat to international public health. He was immediately impressed by Rashida's comprehensive understanding of the disease, her meticulous research methods, and her ability to coordinate complex investigations involving multiple international organizations. "I've worked with researchers all over the world," Dr. Chen told her during one of their collaborative meetings, "but I have never met anyone who combines such sophisticated scientific training with such deep understanding of how diseases actually affect real communities. You don't just study these pathogens in the laboratory, you understand how they spread through villages, how people's living conditions affect their susceptibility, and how treatment programs need to be designed to work in places where resources are limited." Dr. Chen's observation led to an invitation that would change the trajectory of Rashida's career. The CDC was looking for researchers who could lead international collaborations on emerging infectious diseases, particularly in Asia and Africa, where many new pathogens were being discovered. The position would require her to relocate to Atlanta, but it would also provide resources for research on a scale that was impossible in Bangladesh. along with opportunities to influence global health policy at the highest levels. The decision to accept the CDC position was agonizing for Rashida. Moving to the United States would mean leaving her family, her country, and the communities where her research had always been grounded. But it would also provide opportunities to address infectious disease problems on a global scale, with access to funding, technology, and collaborative networks that could multiply the impact of her work. After months of deliberation, she decided that the potential to help millions of people around the world justified the personal sacrifices that relocation would require. Her farewell ceremony at the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research was attended by hundreds of colleagues, students, and community health workers whose lives she had touched during her years in Bangladesh. Dr. Ahmed, who had been her first research mentor, spoke about watching a brilliant village girl transform into an internationally recognized scientist, while never losing sight of her commitment to serving the world's most vulnerable populations. Rashida has shown us that the best science comes from researchers who understand not just how diseases work in the laboratory, but how they affect real people in real communities, she said. She carries with her the hopes and dreams of everyone who believes that knowledge should be used to heal the world. The transition to life in the United States was challenging in ways that Rashida had not fully anticipated. The CDC facilities were impressive beyond anything she had imagined. Laboratories equipped with the most advanced technology available, library resources that provided access to every medical journal and database in the world, and collaborative networks that connected her with researchers on every continent. But the cultural adjustment required learning new social norms, professional expectations, and ways of communicating that sometimes felt as foreign as learning a new language. Her colleagues at the CDC were uniformly welcoming and respectful, but she found herself once again navigating the challenges of being different from most of her peers. Her background in rural health gave her perspectives that were valuable, but sometimes difficult to communicate to researchers who had spent their entire careers in well-funded institutions. Her approach to research, which always considered practical implementation challenges alongside scientific questions, sometimes seemed overly complicated to colleagues who were accustomed to focusing on narrow technical problems. Despite these challenges, Rashida's research program at the CDC flourished. With access to advanced equipment and international collaborative networks, she was able to pursue questions that had been impossible to address in Bangladesh. Her team began developing rapid diagnostic tests for multiple infectious diseases, creating treatment protocols that could be implemented in resource-limited settings, and training international networks of researchers and healthcare workers in disease surveillance and outbreak response. By 2015, Dr. Rashida Rahman had established herself as one of the world's leading experts in infectious diseases affecting tropical and subtropical regions. Her research program at the CDC had produced dozens of scientific papers, influenced international health policy, and trained a new generation of researchers dedicated to addressing diseases that disproportionately affected the world's poorest populations. But the discovery that would define her legacy and transform global health was still ahead of her, emerging from a collaboration that began with what seemed like a routine consultation. The initial request came from Dr. Maria Santos, a Brazilian epidemiologist working with Doctors Without Borders in Central Africa. Several villages in the Democratic Republic of Congo were experiencing outbreaks of a severe diarrheal disease that was not responding to any known treatments. The symptoms were devastating. Patients developed severe dehydration within hours, and mortality rates were approaching 40% despite aggressive supportive care. Laboratory tests had ruled out cholera, typhoid, and all other known bacterial and viral causes of severe diarrheal illness. Local health authorities were desperate for assistance from international disease experts. Rashida arrived in the Congo with a small team of researchers and a mobile laboratory that could perform sophisticated diagnostic tests under field conditions. The villages affected by the outbreak were among the most remote she had ever visited, accessible only by helicopter and lacking not just medical facilities, but basic infrastructure like clean water or electricity. The conditions reminded her powerfully of her childhood in rural Bangladesh, but the disease she encountered was unlike anything in her extensive experience with diarrheal illnesses. The pathogen they eventually isolated was a bacterium that shared some characteristics with known causes of diarrheal disease, but had genetic features that appeared to be entirely novel. More puzzling still, the bacterium seemed to have an unusual ability to survive in environmental conditions that should have killed most known pathogens. It remained viable in water sources for weeks, could survive extreme temperatures, and appeared to be resistant to most standard disinfection methods. This combination of characteristics made it both highly contagious and extremely difficult to control using conventional public health measures. Working 18-hour days in a makeshift laboratory set up in a village school building, Rashida's team gradually unraveled the mystery of the new pathogen. The bacterium, which they eventually named Enterobacter lethalis, had apparently evolved in isolated water sources, where it had developed unprecedented survival capabilities. Climate change and human migration patterns had recently brought people into contact with these previously isolated bacterial reservoirs, creating the conditions for outbreaks that could spread rapidly through communities with limited access to clean water and sanitation. The immediate challenge was developing treatments that could save patients who were already infected, but the longer-term implications were terrifying. If Enterobacter lethalis spread beyond Central Africa, it could cause epidemics that would dwarf any previous diarrheal disease outbreaks. The bacterium's resistance to environmental stresses meant that it could potentially survive in water systems and sewage treatment facilities that normally prevented the spread of similar diseases. Its rapid progression and high mortality rate meant that even small outbreaks could overwhelm healthcare systems and cause enormous human suffering. Rashida's team worked frantically to develop both diagnostic tests and treatment protocols, but conventional approaches proved ineffective. The bacterium was resistant to most antibiotics, and supportive care alone was insufficient to keep patients alive long enough for their immune systems to fight off the infection. They needed entirely new approaches to treatment, and they needed them quickly, as the outbreak continued to spread to new villages and threatened to reach larger population centers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Rashida had been reviewing historical medical literature, searching for accounts of similar diseases that might provide clues about treatment approaches. She discovered reports from early 20th century medical missions describing a severe diarrheal illness that had occasionally appeared in Central Africa, but had seemed to disappear spontaneously after brief outbreaks. The historical accounts were limited, but they mentioned that traditional healers had sometimes achieved success treating similar conditions with preparations made from specific local plants. Working with local traditional healers and ethnobotanists, Rashida's team began investigating plants that had historically been used to treat severe diarrheal illnesses. The process was painstaking. Most of the traditional knowledge had been passed down orally and varied significantly between different ethnic groups and regions. Moreover, translating traditional healing practices into scientifically validated treatments required extensive testing to identify active compounds, determine effective dosages, and verify safety profiles. The plant that eventually yielded the breakthrough was Kaya senegalensis, a tree species native to Central Africa that traditional healers had used for generations to treat various digestive ailments. The bark of this tree contained compounds that had never been scientifically studied, but preliminary testing suggested they might have activity against Enterobacter lethalis. Working with medicinal chemists at the CDC and pharmaceutical researchers around the world, Rashida's team began the complex process of isolating, purifying, and testing the active compounds. The first successful treatment came after months of laboratory work and clinical trials conducted under emergency protocols, approved by international health authorities. The compounds derived from Kaya senegalensis, when properly prepared and administered, proved remarkably effective against Enterobacter lethalis. Patients who received the treatment within the first 24 hours of symptom onset had survival rates approaching 90%, compared to mortality rates of 40% or higher with supportive care alone. But developing an effective treatment was only the beginning of the challenge. The new therapy had to be manufactured under conditions that ensured consistent quality and potency, distributed to remote areas with limited infrastructure, and administered by healthcare workers who might have limited training in complex medical procedures. Rashida found herself working not just as a researcher, but as a program director, coordinating manufacturing, distribution, training, and quality control systems that could operate effectively in some of the world's most challenging environments. The global health implications of the discovery became clear as surveillance systems detected Enterobacter lethalis in water sources across multiple countries in Central and West Africa. What had initially appeared to be isolated outbreaks in remote villages was actually the emergence of a new pathogen that threatened to become a major cause of mortality across the region. The World Health Organization declared the outbreaks a public health emergency of international concern and established Rashida as the lead coordinator for international response efforts. Managing a global disease outbreak required skills and experience that went far beyond scientific research. Rashida found herself coordinating with government health ministries, international aid organizations, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and local communities in dozens of countries. She had to navigate complex political situations where national governments were reluctant to acknowledge disease outbreaks that might damage their international reputations. She had to work with aid organizations that had competing priorities and limited resources. Most challengingly, she had to ensure that life-saving treatments reached the rural communities that needed them most, despite logistical obstacles that often seemed insurmountable. The success of the treatment program exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 2 years of the initial discovery, Enterobacter lethalis outbreaks had been controlled throughout Africa, and surveillance systems had been established to detect and respond to future outbreaks before they could spread widely. More than 50,000 lives had been saved through the treatment program, and millions more had been protected by improved water safety and sanitation measures that prevented the spread of the disease. The international recognition that followed was unprecedented for a researcher who had begun her career in rural Bangladesh. Rashida received invitations to speak at the world's most prestigious medical conferences, was awarded honorary doctorates from universities across multiple continents, and found herself being consulted by world leaders on matters of global health policy. The discovery had established her as one of the most influential medical researchers of her generation, but it had also created new responsibilities and opportunities that would shape the next phase of her career. The pharmaceutical industry took notice of the breakthrough, offering her lucrative positions and partnerships that could have made her enormously wealthy. But Rashida's motivations had never been primarily financial. Instead, she used her newfound influence to advocate for research programs focused on diseases that affected the world's poorest populations, diseases that were often ignored by commercial pharmaceutical development because they offered limited profit potential. She established a foundation dedicated to developing treatments for neglected tropical diseases and training researchers from developing countries to lead their own programs addressing local health challenges. The transformation from village girl to internationally acclaimed scientist was complete. But Rashida had not forgotten the lessons of her childhood, or abandoned her commitment to serving communities like the one where she had grown up. The success of her Enterobacter lethalis research had provided her with resources and influence that she immediately began directing toward addressing health problems that affected the world's most vulnerable populations. In 2018, she established the Rahman Institute for Global Health, a research and training organization dedicated to developing practical solutions for diseases that disproportionately affected rural and impoverished communities. The Rahman Institute represented a new model for international health research, one that prioritized collaboration with researchers and healthcare workers from the countries most affected by the diseases being studied. Rather than the traditional approach of international experts conducting research in developing countries and then departing with their findings, Rashida insisted that her institute's projects be led by local researchers who understood the cultural, economic, and logistical challenges of implementing health interventions in their own communities. The institute provided funding, training, and technical support, but leadership and decision-making authority remained with the communities being served. The institute's first major project focused on developing improved treatments for tuberculosis, a disease that continued to kill millions of people annually, despite the availability of effective treatments. The problem was not lack of medical knowledge, but rather the difficulty of ensuring that patients in remote areas could access and complete the lengthy treatment regimens required for cure. Working with researchers and healthcare providers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Institute developed new drug formulations that reduced treatment time from 6 months to 6 weeks, along with innovative delivery systems that could reach patients in the most isolated communities. The Tuberculosis Project demonstrated the Institute's approach to translating scientific research into real-world health improvements. Rather than simply publishing research papers and hoping that others would implement the findings, Rashida's team worked directly with government health ministries, international aid organizations, and local healthcare providers to ensure that new treatments reached the patients who needed them. They provided training for healthcare workers, established supply chains for drug distribution, and created monitoring systems to track treatment outcomes and identify areas where improvements were needed. The international recognition continued to accumulate. In 2019, Rashida was awarded the World Health Organization's highest honor for her contributions to global health. The citation specifically mentioned not just her scientific discoveries, but her innovative approaches to ensuring that medical research translated into improved health outcomes for the world's poorest populations. She was invited to deliver the keynote address at the World Health Assembly, where she spoke to health ministers and medical leaders from 194 countries about the need to prioritize diseases affecting the global poor. Medical research has traditionally focused on problems that affect wealthy populations in developed countries, she said in her address to the World Health Assembly. We have sophisticated treatments for diseases that primarily affect people who can afford expensive health care, while millions die from conditions that could be prevented or cured with relatively simple interventions. This is not just a scientific failure, it is a moral failure. We have the knowledge and technology to address most of the health problems that cause suffering in low-income communities. What we lack is the commitment to prioritize these problems and the innovation to develop solutions that work in resource-limited settings. Her speech was widely credited with influencing a major shift in international health research priorities. Funding agencies began directing more resources toward neglected tropical diseases. Pharmaceutical companies established new programs for developing treatments for diseases affecting the global poor, and medical schools around the world began incorporating global health perspectives into their curricula. The Rahman Doctrine, as it came to be known, argued that medical research had both scientific and moral obligations to address health problems in proportion to their impact on human suffering, rather than their potential for commercial profit. The personal recognition culminated in 2020 when Rashida was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for her discovery of Enterobacter lethalis and development of effective treatments for this emerging infectious disease. The Nobel Committee's citation specifically recognized not just the scientific significance of her discovery, but also her innovative approaches to ensuring that scientific breakthroughs translated into improved health outcomes for underserved populations. She became the first person from Bangladesh to receive a Nobel Prize in any scientific category, and her achievement was celebrated across her home country as validation of the potential that existed within communities that had traditionally been excluded from educational and scientific opportunities. The Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm was attended by members of her family, including her elderly parents, who had made the long journey from their village in Bangladesh to witness their daughter receive the world's highest scientific honor. Abdul Rahman, now in his 70s and still wearing the simple clothes of a rice farmer, wept openly as he watched his daughter deliver her Nobel lecture to an audience that included some of the world's most distinguished scientists. Fatima, who had never learned to read but had always supported her daughter's dreams, sat in the front row of the Stockholm concert hall, her face radiating pride as she listened to simultaneous translation of Rashida's speech about the importance of using science to serve humanity's most vulnerable members. In her Nobel lecture, Rashida reflected on the journey that had brought her from a mud house in rural Bangladesh to the stage of the world's most prestigious scientific award ceremony. She spoke about the teachers who had recognized her potential, the family members who had supported her unconventional path, and the communities that had shaped her understanding of how medical research could address real-world health problems. But she also used the platform to challenge the international scientific community to do more to ensure that the benefits of medical research reached everyone who needed them. The disease that brought me to your attention, Enterobacter lethalis, was discovered not in a sophisticated laboratory, but in remote villages where people were dying from a condition that medical science had never encountered, she said. The treatment that has saved tens of thousands of lives was developed not through conventional pharmaceutical research, but by combining modern scientific methods with traditional healing knowledge that had been preserved for generations by communities that most of the world had forgotten. These communities, rural, poor, marginalized, are not just recipients of medical charity. They are partners in the scientific enterprise, with knowledge, insights, and perspectives that are essential for addressing the health challenges facing our interconnected world. The Nobel Prize brought with it not just recognition, but also resources that Rashida immediately directed toward expanding her institute's work. The prize money was donated in its entirety to establish scholarship programs for students from rural and impoverished communities who wanted to pursue careers in medicine and scientific research. She used her enhanced international profile to advocate for increased funding for neglected tropical diseases and to promote research collaborations between institutions in developed and developing countries. The Institute's work expanded rapidly in the years following the Nobel Prize. New research programs were established to address malaria, dengue fever, Chagas disease, and dozens of other conditions that affected millions of people, but received limited attention from mainstream medical research. Training programs were created to develop research capacity in universities and medical schools across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Perhaps most importantly, the Institute pioneered new models for international research collaboration that ensured that communities affected by diseases had meaningful participation in the research designed to help them. Today, as Dr. Rashida Rahman approaches her 54th birthday, she continues to lead one of the world's most influential global health research organizations from her headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. The journey from that small mudhouse in Kumargaon to the international stage of scientific leadership represents more than just personal achievement. It demonstrates the transformative power of education, determination, and a refusal to accept limitations imposed by circumstances of birth. The village where she grew up has changed dramatically in the decades since she left to attend high school in the district town. The Rahman Institute established a rural health clinic there in 2021, providing modern medical care to communities across the region. The clinic is staffed by doctors and nurses trained through the Institute's programs, many of them young people from rural backgrounds who were inspired by Rashida's example to pursue careers in healthcare. The one-room school that once excluded girls now serves students of all genders, and several of its recent graduates have received scholarships to attend universities in Dhaka and abroad. Abdul and Fatima Rahman, now in their 80s, still live in Kumargaon, though their mud house has been replaced by a modest brick structure with electricity, running water, and a small library filled with books that Rashida sends from around the world. Abdul continues to farm his small plot of land, though he now employs modern techniques that have increased his yields and reduced the physical demands of agricultural work. Fatima has learned to read and write, achieving at age 75 a goal that had seemed impossible when she was young. She often sits in the evening reading books aloud to